don't want to lose you, but we think you ought to go for your king and your country.
The First World War was dubbed the Great War. Destructive and all-embracing as it was, it marked the end of an era in which the concert of powers in and surrounding Europe had competed for influence, power and territory. Their conflicts now spilled over to become the world's conflicts. The Middle East, above all, was to feel the consequences. Of the imperial powers that had drained the blood of the world in that great war, 3 were in effect obliterated. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had stood as the bulwark of Christendom, it shrank and divided. Imperial Russia collapsed before Bolshevism. But greatest change of all, the Ottoman Empire, one of the world's longest lived and widest spread, disappeared altogether. In October 1918, off the Aegean island of Modrus, a delegation representing the Ottoman Sultan arrived to sign a ceasefire agreement with Great Britain. It was, in effect, an admission of final collapse and defeat. What had happened to reduce this great power to such ignominious impotence? At its widest spread, the Ottoman Empire stretched from Persia to the gates of Vienna. But incapable of adequate modernization to compete with its industrialized European rivals, it had for over a century been marking time, gradually dying and disintegrating. Militarily, it had failed to keep up with Europe. Its forces were semi-mercenary, recruited from all over the empire. That empire itself was heterogeneous, nationally and ethnically. The hard spirit of 19th century European nationalism made it difficult for the Ottomans to restrain the individual nationalisms that sprang up within their empire. And anyway, it was bankrupt. The burden of external debt which it took on in the attempt to compete with the new modern Europe left it too weak to resist increasing foreign intervention in its affairs. It had indeed been the sick man of Europe for a long time, and now it was dead. A new Middle East began to emerge, with new political entities and, inevitably, new tensions. New rulers were to make their appearance in the region. But why was it to be the British in Egypt or in Palestine? Why the French in the Levant? For Britain, the Middle East was a vital link in the worldwide chain of the British Empire. This was the route by sea and land to the jewel of the British Crown, India. When Prime Minister Disraeli bought the Suez Canal for Britain in 1875, it became the single most important factor in British thinking about the Middle East. In 1882, a permanent garrison was sent to protect it. British interest in the region further increased with the discovery of oil, first in Persia, then in Mesopotamia or Iraq. Wells were drilled and pipelines were laid to gather this new cheap fuel. Indeed, in 1913, under Winston Churchill's direction, the British Navy itself substituted oil for coal for its ships. With oil now added to the other strategic British interests in the region, Britain was even more determined to gain the lion's share from the Ottoman collapse. The French, on the other hand, had none of Britain's military or naval power in the Middle East. But in terms of commercial, cultural and political influence, they were deeply involved, particularly in the Levant. There they had developed their trade with the richest part of the region, in wine, silk and textiles. The French ran the Ottoman Bank. Utilities like gas and electricity, and, above all, railways. Beirut and Damascus were centers of French culture and language. Indeed, French was the adopted foreign tongue of much of the Arab world's small Western educated class. And the French were recognized too as the patrons of the Roman Catholic minorities. Tsarist Russia was another power with a long historic interest in the region, partly because of the links of the Orthodox Church with the holy places in Palestine, but also for more mundane strategic reasons. Free entry through the Dardanelles to the Mediterranean from the Black Sea would allow Russia a year-round ability to be a world naval power. In an agreement made during the Great War, Britain and France had promised their then ally, Russia, a slice of the Ottoman Empire and the control of the straits it wanted. But the 1918 Communist Revolution and the civil war which followed it were to remove Russia from the arena. Italy, a latecomer to the business of empire, was primarily concerned with the Dodecanese islands of the Aegean and with its ambitions for influence in the southwestern parts of Ottoman Anatolia. As for Greece, its main ambitions were in Thrace and Asia Minor, where more than 2 million Greeks were living. So there were a number of countries on the victorious side in the Great War looking for pickings from the Ottoman collapse. But Britain and France were by far the greatest powers, and it was they who, between 1915 and the end of the war, had made a number of secret treaties arranging the division of the spoils. The Constantinople Agreement of March 1915 dealt with Russian interests. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of May 1916 settled matters between Britain and France, and the Saint-Jean de Maurienne Agreement of 1917 covered Italian claims. Of these secret deals, the Sykes-Picot Agreement was the rarely important one. Essentially, it divided between Britain and France the Arab areas of the Ottoman Empire. There were to be 3 categories. Some were to be directly ruled by Britain or France. Some would be designated spheres of influence for Britain or France, while they would exclusively provide advisors for the Arab rulers, and would also have the imperial benefits of control of trade. And there would be internationally controlled areas in Palestine, with its special interest for the separate churches of Christendom. This secret Sykes-Picot Agreement between British and French governments was to produce the map of the Middle East as we know it. But there were other promises. While Britain and France were playing the game of great imperial powers with territory they did not yet control, for victory they needed the help of the people who lived in the area or had an influence in it. And therefore, alongside the secret deals with each other, the powers made promises in return for the support of a number of different peoples in the area. The Kurds, for instance, had long been a thorn in the side of the Ottoman Empire, as well as Russia. They were also troublesome in northern Mesopotamia, which Britain wished to control because of the oil fields. so the British encouraged the Kurds in their nationalistic aspirations. The Armenians were also made promises, mainly by the Americans, that they could establish some sort of autonomous state in eastern Anatolia. For so long, the Armenians had been a people without a country of their own. And the Greeks were encouraged by Britain to revive part of their Hellenic empire in Asia, and at least to try to control Constantinople with its command of the Dardanelles. Some of these promises and aspirations were to be satisfied, most were not. But anyway, they were peripheral to the heart of the Middle East. It was the promises made to the Arabs, who had for so long been under Ottoman control, which were to have the greatest consequence. To protect the Suez Canal and Egypt, Britain first made common cause with Arab leaders in the Hejaz, which contained the holy places of Islam, Mecca and Medina. In a correspondence with Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the head of the Hashemite family, Britain's promise implied that the Arab lands, which had no formal divisions into national states under the Ottomans, would be liberated as a whole. Yet the correspondence made clear that the Mediterranean coast, the area west of the Aleppo-Damascus line, was to be excluded from this new Arab state. This seminal British promise was the main incentive for the Arab Rebellion of 1916, as the Arabs came to Britain's assistance. Led by the Emir Faisal, the son of the Sharif of Mecca, Arab irregulars joined with British officers like Colonel T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, first in driving the Ottomans out of Arabia, then in protecting the Aqaba area, and eventually in defeating the Ottomans right up through Transjordan to Syria. But there was another group of people to whom another wartime promise was made that was to have equally long-term effects in the region. That promise was to the Zionists. Britain had always regarded Palestine as one of the keys to the defense of Suez and sought allies there. The Zionists had a small volunteer force aiding the British Army in the Middle East. Britain wanted Zionist support in the world conflict. Britain hoped to achieve this by being the first to recognize the Zionist claim to a Jewish national home in Palestine. So Lord Balfour, on behalf of the British government, sent a letter to Lord Rothschild, chairman of the Zionist Federation in Britain, which contained what has ever since been known as the Balfour Declaration, British support for the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine. These two promises, to the Arabs and to the Zionists, may not have seemed conflicting at the time, but they laid the seeds for conflicts that are still with us. But these promises were all concerned with what would happen after the war. It had still to be won. It was only in the second half of 1917 that the breakthrough came. General Allenby pierced the Ottoman lines and entered Palestine. On December the 8th, 1917, Allenby accepted the surrender of Jerusalem and marched into the Holy City. In his victory speech, General Allenby promised religious freedom to all, to Muslims, Christians, and Jews. At the same time, the Arab soldiers of Emir Faisal and Lawrence, working further to the east in Transjordan, seized Amman and Daraa, blocking the Daraa-Afula line, so vital to the Ottoman defence. And the next year, British and Arab forces marched into Damascus, the jewelled heart of Syria itself. At last, Arab land was to be free of Ottoman control. A month later, on October the 30th, 1918, the Ottomans surrendered in Madras harbour aboard the British warship Agamemnon. As it sailed into the Bosphorus and dropped anchor in the Golden Horn, the demise of the sick man of Europe was final. On November the 11th, 1918, the armistice between the Allies and Germany was signed. The Great War had come to an end. Now, the inheritors of Ottoman power, in particular Britain and France, had to decide what they would do with it, and do so in the face of competing interests, treaties, and those promises made during the tense days of the Great War. But there were new obstacles and problems now appearing. The breath of freedom was now blowing through the Middle East and was being encouraged by outside influences. The new Soviet Russia renounced all the treaties and claims made by the Tsarist regime and called for national movements to do away with colonialism. Meanwhile, the United States was in a mood of international righteousness. President Woodrow Wilson's famous 14 points recognized the right of all peoples to self-determination. With these sort of influences, the people of the Middle East were even less inclined to welcome British and French dominance in place of the Ottoman power that had just collapsed. In Syria, where the Hashemite Emir Faisal had established himself in Damascus, the French attempt to take over its expected sphere of influence was bitterly resisted. In Mesopotamia, Iraq, anti-government riots broke out in 1919. Despite the strong post-war desire in Britain to bring its armies back home, the British government had to retain large forces there to keep order. In Egypt, the Wafd, the national movement, organized a vigorous campaign for full independence from Britain, now that the war was over. Persia was in chaos from the end of the war. Britain tried to impose an agreement which would, in effect, place Persia under British protection, but this was rejected by the Persian parliament. Here, Britain decided not to impose its will, but kept its naval forces nearby to protect its oil interests in the Gulf. In Palestine, too, there were riots. Apart from Arab aspirations to independence, and therefore resistance to British rule, there was also fierce opposition to Zionism. Britain and France, though, still intended to put their secret agreements into effect. The British had massive superiority on the ground in the Middle East, and this meant that London, rather than Paris, was in the stronger position to dictate terms. In December 1918, Britain and France made a secret revision of the Sykes-Picot agreements. Premier Clemenceau of France visited the British Prime Minister Lloyd George at number 10 Downing Street. Clemenceau later reported their conversation as follows. I was deeply conscious of the need for friendly relations between the two countries, he wrote, and was most anxious to prevent any collision of interests in the Middle East. I therefore asked the British Prime Minister what modification in the Sykes-Picot Agreement England desired. He replied, Mosul. I said, you shall have it. Anything else? He replied, Palestine. Again I said, you shall have it. This new agreement gave both Palestine and Mosul, with the control of its oil, to the British. In return, Lloyd George permitted the French their greatest desire, control of the Syrian and Lebanese coast and of Damascus. A year later, the British withdrew their forces from Syria, thus abandoning their ally, the Emir Faisal, leaving the way open for the French to drive him from Damascus. In January 1919, the victors in the Great War met in the Palace of Versailles near Paris to begin building a new world from the ruins of the old one. Their efforts to attain a just and lasting peace were hampered by their conflicting interests and local and international pressures. But the shock of the war forced people to think seriously for the first time of creating a new structure that might avert such disasters in the future. On the 28th of April 1919, the Covenant of the League of Nations was finally approved. The Covenant included 26 articles. Among other things, it presented a complete mechanism for the peaceful settlement of disputes. It also created a system of supervision of the various colonies and territories from which the German or Ottoman rulers had been ejected. That system was called the Mandate. It was supposed to be a stepping stone on the road to independence for the former subject peoples. The great powers would supply help and guidance to them. The Charter of the League of Nations laid down a definition of this novel form of rule, the Mandate. The tutelage of such peoples should be entrusted to advanced nations who, by reason of their resources, their experience, or their geographical position, can best undertake this responsibility, and who are willing to accept it, and that this tutelage should be exercised by them as mandatories on behalf of the League. As far as the Middle East was concerned, this mandate system was thus a compromise between the concern of Britain and France to ensure their presence there and the local and international pressures for local independence. But to many, it looked more like a new form of legalized colonialism. On April the 24th, 1920, the peace conference at San Remo completed the process of dividing up the Middle East officially. France, as it had wished, was given a mandate over Syria and the Lebanon. Britain was given mandates over Iraq and over Palestine, which at that time was bracketed with the territory of Transjordan. Other national interests, too, were confirmed. The Mosul area of Mesopotamia was handed over to the British as part of the new Iraq. Four months later, the Allied powers and the defunct Ottoman Empire signed the Treaty of Sèvres, by which Sultan Mohammed VI confirmed the new territorial dispositions and surrendered all his former European and Arab possessions. The French sphere of influence corresponded exactly to that assigned to France by the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The Italian sphere covered the areas in southwestern Anatolia promised them in the two wartime agreements, less the region of Izmir. The town and district of Izmir, Smyrna to the Greeks, were placed under Greek administration. Above all, Turkey had to agree to international control over the Straits. The division of the Arab lands was a foregone conclusion, but the most important effect of the onerous terms of the treaty was on the Ottomans themselves. The Treaty of Sèvres reduced the Ottoman state to a small country, totally dependent on the goodwill of the victors. Its army was limited to 50,000 men, and the Turks felt not only humiliated, but also exposed to the likely depredations of historic enemies like the Greeks. The Turks were now confined in effect to Anatolia, and this generated an inevitable reaction, a Turkish national revival movement, and to lead it there appeared a remarkable man. He was Mustafa Kemal, to be known to the world as Atatürk. He had made a name for himself when he successfully organized the Ottoman defense against the Allied landings at Gallipoli in the Great War. When in May 1919, General Mustafa Kemal was ordered to go to eastern Anatolia and demobilize the remaining Ottoman troops, he disobeyed orders. He had a strong motive. He was fired with nationalistic fervor and indignation because that year, under the leadership of Prime Minister Venizelos and with the enthusiastic support of the British, Greece had invaded western Anatolia and looked as if it would complete the final dismemberment of the empire. So Mustafa Kemal unified what was left of the Ottoman forces and called on the people of Anatolia to join in the sacred mission of repelling the Greek invaders. He also took the opportunity of starting to create round himself a new civil power for his country, no longer based on an empire, but on the areas where the Turkish-speaking people were a majority. He held congresses in Erzurum and Sivas, at which nationalist passions were progressively fanned. The so-called Society for the Defense of the Rights of Anatolia and Rumeli elected him its president. In April 1920, Mustafa Kemal's Third Congress in Ankara, the future capital, passed some critical resolutions. While the Ottoman Sultan Muhammad was not yet deposed, it was recognized that he could not at that moment act for the country, since he was, in effect, a captive of the Allied powers in Constantinople. Hence, a national covenant was drafted, calling for the establishment of a Turkish national state in areas with a Turkish-speaking majority. The state was to be fully sovereign in its powers and free of all foreign intervention in its affairs. To make a reality of the covenant ratified at Ankara, Mustafa Kemal had to confront both the conquerors and those people who shared Anatolia, who were trying to extend their influence in it. The first phase of the campaign involved pushing the Armenians back to the Caucasus, after which Mustafa Kemal concluded the Treaty of Alexandropol with the Soviets, which recognized their mutual borders. Aside from political and economic collaboration, Kemal also obtained a supply of arms from the Russians. Italy was neutralized by clever diplomacy. Italian troops were withdrawn from southwestern Anatolia in return for preferential trade terms there. France, too, after clashes with Turkish irregulars, withdrew its forces from the areas which had been designated for its control, again in return for preferential trade terms in those areas. With growing domestic support and fewer potential enemies, Kemal was now able to concentrate on defeating the Greek invaders. The essential major victory was won in August 1922 at the Sakarya River. The Greek army collapsed and, leaving all the occupied territories, withdrew in panic to the port of Izmir. Later, with the city set on fire by the Turks, the Greeks left altogether, returned home and abandoned Anatolia's Greek and Armenian Christians. The British alone looked as if they might now oppose Kemal militarily, anxious as they still were about the Dardanelles waterway. But they found no international support. And in October 1922, a final Greco-Turkish ceasefire was agreed upon. Ultimately, in July 1923, the international powers accepted Turkey's new status with the Lausanne Convention. This gave back to Turkey most of the things it needed for its national pride. It could again have its own armed forces without restriction. Foreign supervision of its affairs was stopped, and Turkey was recognized as an independent state. But, and this was the important thing for the Middle East, all Turkish claims to former lands which did not contain a Turkish-speaking majority were renounced. Turkey now set out to organize itself as a sovereign state, with Mustafa Kemal as the chief architect. In 1923, at the head of the army of the new Turkey, he entered Istanbul, unifying the country under his new regime. Turkey had survived as a nation, though it had lost an empire. Now it was the people who had been subjects in that empire, particularly the Arabs, who had to identify their future. The Ottoman blanket which had lain over them for half a millennium had now been lifted. It is their struggles to establish independence and nationhood which will fill the center of the stage.